This gentleman has led a distinguished and outspoken career in law, as a judge, and more recently as a hard-hitting journalist. Of course, I'm speaking of Judge Les Bewley. He has a keen insight into human behavior and a proven ability to profess the truth, even if it hits home and hurts or aggravates. He's one of the first Canadians to read Mr. Irving's book, Churchill's War, and will now introduce the author. Judge Bewley.
I took great pains to come here this evening wearing my best pinstripe suit and my Churchillian bow tie, hoping to scare the hell out of this author. And I don't know if I have it. I'll adopt the pose and as much of the mannerism as I can, and maybe that will fire him up. My introducer said that he was taught by his old father that there are various types of truth and ways of looking at things. And that reminds me, too, that it's also very true that there is the way we think we are. There is the way we think others think we are. And then thirdly, in fact, lastly, there is the way we are in truth. I do know this. I've met a lot of historians in my lifetime, spoken with some of them, studied under a great number, and most of them are blind as hell. And most of them make a habit of repeating their PhD thesis that they wrote 40 years ago. I read David Irving. I keep going to his footnotes. And the more I read them, of course, the more it slowed me down reading the general text. But I read them assiduously, and I haven't found any mistakes yet. I hope to, but so far I haven't. It strikes me that he would be an enormously capable barrister. There's no doubt in my mind about that. He'd be a world-class barrister in my book, judging by his writing. I don't know what he's going to say, but this I do know, that in the last 20 to 30 years, certainly in North America, and probably the rest of the world, but certainly the country I know best, Canada and North America, there has been an absolutely shocking degree of suppression of the truth by vested interests. But we see more and more and more of it. And I, for one, am glad, immeasurably glad, to lend my voice and my appearance and any support I can give to any group of people who insist that this form of censorship come to an end. And we will never be true to our traditions. We will never measure up to the traditions of our ancestors unless we insist, as they have and fought for it, that we have the damn right to read what we please uncensored. Yeah. And that we must have. Now, I do not know what the book reviewers and the media, what treatment they'll give David Irving's book. I suspect it will be low-key. I suspect it won't be very reverent. I suspect it will be full of pejorative remarks such as racism and all the rest. In my book, quite undeserved from what I've read. I suspect he will not get the same publicity and encouragement that some Canadian authors who write about intercourse with a bear would get. Our Vancouver Island poetesses who marry prisoners and get them out on early parole is getting. I suspect he won't get the reverential treatment that these others will get. But I say that's their loss if they don't recognize it. Because this, to me, is an author who is not afraid to tell it as it is. And we may shudder at some of the things he said. I was invited last year to make the principal address to the Winston Churchill Society. Because certain people know that I happen to have had a great regard for Winston Churchill. I couldn't, for a number of reasons, make it, otherwise I would have made it. And then I read David Irving's book, and my hackles are up so far you could almost brush the chandeliers with them. And I got madder and madder and madder. Then I looked in the mirror and said, "You damn fool, what are you getting mad about? This man's telling the truth as far as I can see, and he documents it very well." And said, "What if somebody you took as your idol, who may not be your idol after, has the truth told about him?" One of the greatest things about Oliver Cromwell was that when he sat for his portrait painter, he said, "Paint me warts and all." Warts and all. I think Cromwell deserves to be a hero apart from anything else for saying that. But John A. MacDonald's still one of my heroes. And he didn't stop being my hero after I read out that he'd taken money from the CPR, and he used to get violently drunk and throw up outside parliamentary windows. So I say, let's have it. The truth will do none of us any harm. And those of us who learn to respect and admire Winston Churchill, almost beyond all men sometimes, will not be any the worse for learning he has human failings, and sometimes worse than human failings, because at last we may have the truth in our hands and the perspective. And the end result of all these individuals' actions are what we need to know. And so I welcome you, Mr. Irving, as a man of obvious courage, guts, and determination. There are few like you, and I wait to hear what you have to say.
Mr. Justice Bewley, Your Honour, Milad, ladies and gentlemen, listening to Justice Bewley's opening remarks, I was reminded of an event in 1970 when I first came up before the Beak in London, not for a traffic offence, but for having committed the heinous offence of defaming a Royal Navy captain, and we appealed it because we were found to have libelled this captain, and we went to the Court of Appeal, we went to the House of Lords, we went to the House of Lords again. In fact, by the time that case had ended, about £250,000 had passed into lawyers' pockets. The famous publishing house of Castles was bankrupted out of existence. And one of the three appeal court judges, I think it was Mr. Justice Phillimore, it might have been Lord Denning, of course, who was probably quite well known in this country as well. Lord Denning, I think it was, who had told the court in a judgment, there's no doubt at all that the author was arrogant, greedy, and conceited, meaning myself. And the Times had the exquisite tact to telephone Mrs. Irving, as it was at that time, who had decided to sit it out at home rather than to appear in court to hear this verdict handed down. The Times telephoned Mrs. Irving and said, "Mrs. Irving, Lord Denning has just described your husband in court this morning as arrogant, greedy, and conceited. What is your comment about that?" And her comment was, "He's not greedy." Well, arrogance, of course, there's nothing wrong with arrogance at all, because that is what we send our children to school for, public schools in Britain. If a child is sent to Eton at enormous expense and comes back without having acquired the necessary arrogance, at the end of the first year or two, we would demand a refund. That is what being British is all about. And frankly, I think that we have every reason to be conceited now that we have succeeded. We've succeeded in producing the book that we said we were going to. We've managed to do this book despite the opposition of the entire Northern Hemisphere media, particularly the publishing houses, who one after the other went around tearing up the contracts they had engaged to publish this book. Doubleday's in the United States, Hoffman and Camper in Germany, Macmillan's, Michael Joseph, Collins, Hodder and Stoughton in England, all tore up the contracts that they had entered into to publish this book, required me to pay back the monies which were due, because the book had taken 10 years by then to write. And it was a chilling experience for an author. This event happened in the years 1984, 1985, after I'd spent 10 years writing the book, and you're still stuck in the middle of the tunnel. If I say I'm stuck in the middle of a tunnel, any of you who have ever spent any length of time writing a lengthy book or even an essay will know what the tunnel is like. You're so far in, you can't go back. There's nothing but darkness behind you. There's no light ahead. You think nothing is going to pull you out into the open air again at the end. And that's where I was stuck, just surrounded by the sound of tearing papers as the contracts were torn up. And out of the darkness ahead came this little chuff, chuff, chuff sound, and a light appearing as a little saddle tank engine appeared, a little Australian saddle tank engine, piloted by Mr. Raymond P. White, who's sitting behind the desk here at this moment, the managing director of Veritas himself. We owe it to him. We owe it to Raymond White. With his extraordinary publishing operation in the outback in Australia, that he came forward to me 2.5 years ago and he said, can we do the Churchill book for you? And I said, prove you can do a book first, because until that time he had basically established himself publishing brochures about Aboriginal land rights and eminently worthy causes like that, but a book is a different matter altogether. It's not just a question of having the will to publish what you find on the manuscript. You've got to produce it in a publishable form. You've got to find distributors. You've got to get the media to accept it. You've got to break through any number of taboos. You've got to break through a lot of vested interest to get the book out. Well, the result we have seen in the last 4 weeks in Australia, where I just came up from Australia, New Zealand 4 or 5 days ago, Los Angeles first, then to Vancouver last night. As Mr. Davis said in his introduction, the extraordinary feat has occurred that at the beginning of the period, 4 or 5 weeks ago, the Australian booksellers didn't want to know about the books. They said they weren't going to deal with a minor publisher. Within 2 weeks, the book was on the bestseller lists in Australia. Within 3 weeks, we were number 10. Within 3.5 weeks, we were number 3 non-fiction bestseller. We are now the number 1 non-fiction bestseller in Australia, the whole of the continent, and number 3 right at the top. The number 3 position right across the continent of all categories of books. It's an extraordinary achievement for a minor Australian publisher. And I think the way we've done it, if I can just dwell very briefly on the actual product, is that it's a very well-produced book. You don't find books produced like this in the Northern Hemisphere anymore. It's cloth-bound, silk-bound. It's got a little flag in it, like books used to have in the good old days. It's on acid-free paper, so this book is going to last 1,000 years, as Churchill once said about the British Empire. It's going to outlive all the other rival books. The books by Martin Gilbert and all the other authors will crumble to dust in the next 10 or 15 years, and this book will live on because it's on the proper acid-free paper. All these little tricks we put into it because we've cut the corners. We've cut out the middleman all the way up, these famous middlemen who soak up the profits. And the result is that the book has come literally direct from the publisher sitting there behind the desk here into your hands. A minor problem here, I think, in Canada is going to be that you're probably not going to be able to get the book anywhere else, because we now have to break into the distribution system, rather as we broke into the Australian distribution system. For me, the sweetest sound in Australia the last 2 or 3 weeks has been the sound of voices on the television and in the media, and read the articles in the newspapers, where the unanimous cry has been, how did he get in? How did it happen? Who let him in? And boy, were we in. We had 7 prime-time television programs. We had wall-to-wall television coverage. We had the biggest talk shows. We had the biggest chat shows, the midday shows, the evening shows, the good morning shows. We had every single one. They lined up the experts one and after another trying to shoot the book down. They couldn't do that. They couldn't shoot me down, so they tried shooting down the people all around me. They said League of Rights. They said Eric Butler. They said Ray White. They mentioned all these names, and I said, what about the book? Why don't we start talking about the book? That's what I'm here. That's what I'm selling. That's what in the bookshops now. Churchill's warts, I suppose we could call it, if I may paraphrase Justice Bewley. But it isn't, of course. It's the story of Churchill as he really was from the time he was born right through. This is the first half of the 2 volumes, right through, in fact, until Potsdam and his death. It's not all black. It's not all just stories of how he was corrupt, how he was power-hungry, how he drove the British Empire into perdition. There's also the humorous side about the man. And I think that the reason why this book is going to outlast the others is because this book is based on the original archives. It's based on archives the like of which nobody else has ever seen before. I haven't just done what every other historian does, all the academics, the ones who hate me so much. I haven't just gone into the libraries and bought 20 books, taken out 20 books. You see, in Australia, one thing I found, the academic world is now beginning to split down the middle. 2 out of the 3 universities of Sydney, the University of Canberra, Australian National University, the La Trobe University in Melbourne, all of these have instructed their students they are not to read my books. The students have been told, as the students have come forward and told me in person at the meetings that I've held like this down there, they've told me that they have been instructed that they will be penalized if they use my books as sources. Their lecturers, their professors have warned them explicitly not to use my books. And yet at other universities, Wollongong University, for example, south of Sydney, and other universities across the country, across the Commonwealth of Australia, the students have been advised to use my books. So the split is beginning. You can see this, and of course we understand why the veto is there on the others, because the academics don't know the answers. The academics, for once, are in a position where the 2 pupils are asking questions about big logical issues which they themselves, the academics, can't answer because they haven't addressed their minds to them. There's... Excuse me, I may borrow this for a minute. The one logical question, for example, which is thrown up by a document in this brochure which I carry around. You can see it's produced by me. It's very glossy. It glosses over certain unfavorable aspects. It was obviously produced by me because the headline is Irving was right, and you don't find many newspapers admitting that, but they will later on. But down here at the bottom right-hand corner is a German document which I quote so often because it throws into a very odd light the whole of the mythology around the Holocaust. Please note, I didn't say the myth, I say the mythology. All the little side stories of the basic story we're told which justifies World War II. Adolf Hitler ordered the killing of 6 million Jews in Auschwitz. This is the basic kind of story we're given now by Hollywood and Madison Avenue, and because of that, everything else is justified. So this document here, which is from the files of the German Foreign Ministry, German Ministry of Justice rather, from the minister himself, it's signed by him, it's initialed by a very famous German High Court judge. It records a telephone conversation from the chief of the German Reich Chancellery in 1942. And it says, the chief of the Reich Chancellery, Hans Lammers, has informed me that the Führer, Adolf Hitler, has repeatedly declared to him that he wants the final solution postponed until after the war is over. Now, this is the middle of 1942. What do you do with this document? It's a genuine document. You can take it from me, ladies and gentlemen. I can tell you the file and the fascicle number where you can find it in the archives in Koblenz in Germany now, the West German government archives. It isn't a fake at all. It's a genuine document, and you can't pretend it doesn't exist. You've got to find a hypothesis which fits that document, as long as, even if the hypothesis is that document is created during the war as a fake to throw dust in our eyes. That is an acceptable hypothesis, but there are reasons why you can't accept that, because on either side of that document there's a whole file full of documents relating to it. You can't pretend this extraordinary document doesn't exist. You've got to find a reason why Hitler in the middle of 1942 is saying he wants the solution of the Jewish problem postponed until after the war is over. But the historians can't explain this document. So the academics do what they've always done in such a case. They drop it on the floor, they push it under the table, and they pretend it doesn't exist. And they hope that nobody will find it. Because if somebody does find it, and even worse, if somebody prints it, then they, the academics, are going to have to answer questions. And that's the one thing they don't want. Because ever since they entered university, they've been led to believe that there's a mainstream of history. There must be a mainstream of history because all the professors are saying the same thing. And the students are being taught to believe the same thing. They're being given set book lists of set books, telling them which books to buy, and sometimes which books not to get, so that the main version of history stays the same. Which, of course, is baloney. I don't mind if a student is told by his professor, by all means look at David Irving's book, but believe me, he's unreliable, he's untrustworthy, he's hopelessly biased, pro-Hitler or anti-Hitler or pro-Churchill or whatever. He's got a bee in his bonnet. But have a look at Irving's book and see if you can spot the fallacies. That is what students should be told, because one thing I do arrogate to myself, ladies and gentlemen, and this is that I may not have the facts right. I may have the hypotheses wrong, but believe me, I've got documents and sources that the academics will never get. Because I do the work. I spend money on my books. I probably spent about $250,000 researching this book over the 10 years. Visiting the archives around the world, the public archives of Canada and Ottawa, the National Library of Australia in Canberra, the Moscow archives, the Russian, the French, the German, the Czech, the Polish, the Dutch papers, everywhere, because you've got to do that, because I am not Martin Gilbert. I am not the authorized Churchill biographer. I don't have this privileged, exclusive access to the private Churchill files that he alone has. But I'm glad I don't have that, because he has this problem that all the chosen people have. He's chosen by the Churchill family to be their biographer, so he has to be a bit careful about what he writes. And he has another problem, and I don't mean this the least bit offensively, and it isn't an anti-Semitic remark. He also has the problem that he's a Jew, Martin Gilbert. So there are certain things that he probably finds it would not be tactful to put in his book about Churchill, and indeed he hasn't. The great Churchill biography by Martin Gilbert, you will find no reference to the fact that in the mid-1930s, the only people who were financing Churchill and keeping him alive, paying his bills, were the American Jewish community and the Board of Deputies of Jews in London. The evidence is there, it's in the files, it's quite plain to see. We know the exact sums of money, we know when it was paid. The Board of Deputies of Jews admit this themselves. Whaley Cohen, the president of the Board of Deputies in England at that time, his authorized memoirs have been published by a man called Enriquez, and there's the full details of how much money was paid. And yet no one talks about it because it isn't kosher to talk about it in some way, so they don't talk about it. And Martin Gilbert certainly doesn't talk about it. Nor will you find in Martin Gilbert's version of Winston Churchill's life any reference to the very close liaison between Winston Churchill and Chaim Weizmann, the first president of the State of Israel, who during the war years and before the war was one of the world's leading Zionist agitators, or politicians you might say. Now the State of Israel gave me very exclusive and privileged access to all the private papers of Chaim Weizmann, and they gave me photocopies of about 500 pages of the correspondence that passed between Churchill and Weizmann. And Weizmann's notes, his diaries, his notes on his conversations with Churchill, Churchill's secret admissions to Weizmann in the 1930s and 1940s that he was Britain's greatest hidden Zionist. It's in Churchill's own handwriting, things like that, and so it has to be put into a book, and I've put it in here. Because we need to know this. It explains now the political situation in the Middle East to a certain extent. You can't write history unless you write total history. The truth is indivisible. Do you want total truth? Wollt ihr die totale Wahrheit, as I say in German? Do you want total truth? And the answer is the academics don't want it, because sometimes it's awkward. And if I say this, as I have done in this book, then of course you will understand now why a lot of Australian newspapers have heaped slime on me. One or two have said, this anti-Semitic book. I would challenge anybody to find one line of anti-Semitism in this book. They won't find it. But, of course, the mere fact that I have put facts into this book which don't appear in other books makes them stick out like a sore thumb. And so that in itself is in some way anti-Semitic. But it is total history, and it has to be said. We need to know where Churchill was getting his money from. But let me hasten to add, this wasn't the only place he was getting his money from in the 1930s. There was one telephone listener, in fact, in Wellington, New Zealand. I was doing a radio talkback show about a week ago, and a telephone listener phoned in, very interesting old lady, charming English voice, very genteel, saying, Mr. Irving, you're talking through your hat. I was working for Churchill as a private secretary in 1936. I was assigned to him for several weeks, and I worked with him out at Chartwell, his country house. And, of course, I listened with great politeness, because I'm always eager to learn more. And I say, Madam, you worked actually in Chartwell, did you? And she said, yes. And what you say about Churchill is completely wrong. He was the essence of gentility, a perfect gentleman. I remember he looked after his family so well, and I used to sleep out there in a house, one of the outhouses, and he came and said good night to me and kissed me good night on the forehead each night and said, good night, my dear. And I said, Madam, before we go any further, can you tell us a little about Chartwell? What did you see? She said, oh yes, I saw the brick walls that he built, all these famous things. I said, no, not. What about the personnel? Did you see any Oh, there weren't very many personnel there, she said. And I said, but did you see any nurses and nannies? And she said, well, one or two nurses and a few nannies and secretaries and gardeners and cooks and housekeepers, of course, and one or two ghost riders working for Churchill as well. And I said, it's so kind of you to have telephoned in, because perhaps now you would like to estimate to us how Mr. Churchill was paying for all these people on a Member of Parliament's salary of £500 a year. There was a click at the other end of the line as this lady hung up. And I was able then to extrapolate this argument and say, well, we begin to know where he was earning his money, because we are now very well informed about his sources of income. We can't hold it against somebody if they earn money, of course, and it's right, meet and proper that they should do so. Winston Churchill's sources of income in the 1930s, when he was just a member of Parliament, he was no longer a cabinet minister, and a cabinet minister, when he's fired, gets no pension as such in England at that time, so Churchill just got the £500 a year, which wasn't very much. I mean, even in those days it wasn't very much. But he supplemented that by the following. He wrote great books. He wrote Crime and Punishment, War and Peace, Jane Eyre, Uncle Tom's Cabin, Mr. Micawber. He wrote all these famous great books. Not in full length, of course. He wrote small versions of them. He wrote Crime and Punishment in 25 pages of double-spaced typescript. He wrote War and Peace in 25 pages of double-spaced typescript. He was doing this for the Chicago Tribune newspaper syndicate, which had commissioned him to digest all these great works of world literature into just enough space that they would fit on 2 pages of an American newspaper for a rather simple-minded American public to read. And Churchill was doing this for $1,000 a shot in 1933 and 1934. It was what he'd had to do to stay alive. And jolly good luck to him. He was being paid $1,000 apiece by this Chicago Tribune syndicate. You won't find reference to this. The reason I know this was being done is because the papers of that newspaper syndicate are now at the University of Oregon at what I would call Eugene, and what you would probably call Eugene, down in south of Portland. And all the papers of that literary syndicate are down there, and the papers of Churchill's literary agent, including the manuscripts of these great works of literature. And it has to be said that they're very well written. Considering that he has the job of digesting War and Peace into 25 pages, he's done it very well. It has to be said that Churchill, writing at his worst, was better than any other writer writing at his best. He was jolly good. And his speeches were equally good. And his speechifying, his ability as an orator, was what he was valuable for. He became a hired gun, to use Western terminology, a hired gun. He was hired by whoever he seemed useful to. And so his opinions rather tended to flop about. In the 1920s, you find him being very anti-American. In the 1930s and 40s, you find him being rather pro-American. In the beginning of 1920, you find Winston Churchill writing an article which is so viciously anti-Semitic that I couldn't believe he had written it. And I checked up with the bibliographers in Eugene, Oregon, whether this was in fact really written by Churchill or whether it was just put together by some anti-Semitic hack in the 1980s. The answer is that, regrettably, Churchill did write this extraordinarily anti-Semitic article proving that, as he does, that all the Soviet torturers and murderers in history, particularly in Eastern Europe, were in fact Jews. And he goes on in this vein for a whole page of an illustrated magazine in London. But of course by mid-1930s he has changed ground completely to become, as he describes himself, Britain's leading secret Zionist. And so it goes on. You find him as a hired help, writing and saying and speaking whatever he is finding most profitable to do. Until finally, on one glorious occasion, I think in 1937, he writes 2 articles. One for the Evening Standard in London saying war is imminent. The Evening News published on the same day saying war is not likely, says Winston Churchill. I've quoted the 2 articles in here just to give an example. It's one of those most unfortunate things. You probably had hoped there were going to be 7 days between the 2 articles or something. It's unfortunate they should have both have appeared at the same time. In about 1932 or 1933, Winston Churchill then turned his hand to faking paintings. You may think the word faking paintings is unkind, but it's entirely justified. I'm sure you would agree, Your Honour, if a man takes a painting, and he's quite a good painter himself, Churchill's paintings, his impressionist paintings, we've all seen pictures of them in the magazines probably, they fetch a few $1,000s even now, probably $20,000 or $30,000 if they're put on auction, but his paintings in the 1930s didn't fetch very much. Who wanted to own a Winston Churchill? Nobody at all. So he put on the bottom right-hand corner of these paintings the name of a well-known deceased French post-impressionist painter, Monsieur Charles Morin. Now there's a word for that, isn't there? It's quite definitely a felony. He has been faking paintings, and he sent these paintings with the name of a well-known French artist, Charles Morin, M-A-U-R-I-N. M-A-U-R-I-N. He put these names on the paintings and sent them over to Paris to sell on the French art market. And the only person who knows about this, apart from Winston Churchill, who's dead, and me, who's alive before you at this moment, was President Roosevelt. Roosevelt found out in the following rather amusing way. And this, incidentally, is a foretaste of what comes in Volume 2, the second half of this. Roosevelt... Well, post-impressionist. French post-impressionist painter who died in 1908.
That would mean that he impressed his mark after the fellow painted them.
You're going to confuse my audience. We're talking about... They're confused enough already. President Roosevelt in December 1941 invited Churchill over to visit the White House for the first meeting after Pearl Harbor. And the head of the American Fine Arts Commission found out that Churchill was visiting the White House, and he sent a letter to him addressed to Monsieur Charles Morin, care of the White House. A little private joke, and of course the White House mail room weren't privy to the secrets of the French impressionist artistic world, and they registered simply the fact there was no such person staying at the White House, and so the letter stayed in the mail room for the next 5 weeks. Until January 1942, when Churchill went back to England, the letter was then opened, and it read... It's rather amusing, this typical dry American humour. Dear Monsieur Morin, writes the head of the American Fine Art Commission, we were so glad to hear that you are visiting Washington and staying with our president at the White House. We had thought you were dead. However, we're glad to hear that you're alive after all this time, and if you would like to come round sometime to one of our meetings in Washington to discuss some of your better paintings, we'll be glad to invite you to a cup of coffee. Inviting Winston Churchill to a cup of coffee wasn't exactly likely to stimulate the old boy to catch the next plane, of course. But Roosevelt read this letter. It was sent up to him, and he realized who it was addressed to, of course. And he made inquiries of the British Embassy, which are reflected in the Roosevelt papers, asking the British Embassy to find out very discreetly what name Churchill had used in the 1930s when completing his paintings. And 6 weeks later, back comes the telephone reply. In other words, the embassy doesn't send it on paper, they send it by telephone round to the White House. Telephone message, Mr. Churchill used the name Charles Morin. Obviously they're hoping that the man at the White House end will get it written down wrong. As indeed he duly did, M-O-R-I-N, which of course should have put Roosevelt off the scent, but he didn't, because he then wrote a letter to Scotland Yard in London, telling Scotland Yard that the Prime Minister was an art forger. It's a hilarious correspondence, which I alone have found. I don't know why. I think it's possibly because it's in a very unknown, little-used file of the Roosevelt papers, what they call the family file, and I suppose people couldn't be bothered to look at it. Roosevelt, of course, knew from that moment that he had Churchill in his hand. Not only because of that, of course, but Churchill was already in the hand of the Americans. We always think of Winston Churchill as being the epitome of Englishness, the grand old Englishman, England's greatest living son, all these phrases that are buzzing around in our heads even now. The man who said, I didn't become His Majesty's first minister to preside over the dissolution of the British Empire. Things like if we look at the facts, we realize how even that is a lie. He wasn't English. He was half as English as I was. His mother was American. He considered himself to be more American than English. His whole manner was more American than English. His mother was a Jerome. When he had his first wartime meeting with President Roosevelt, before that December 1941 White House visit, he visited President Roosevelt and met him aboard a battleship cruising in the waters off Canada in August 1941, and your Prime Minister, Mackenzie King, wasn't even informed they were there. Mackenzie King found out from Codebreaking that Roosevelt and Churchill were meeting on his doorstep. This was the way that Churchill consulted the leaders of the Commonwealth and Empire. He didn't. He didn't tell Mackenzie King, he didn't tell Menzies down in Australia, he didn't tell Jan Smuts in South Africa, he didn't tell any of the Commonwealth or Empire leaders what he was planning to do. He just took some money from them, he took their blood, of course, their finest, the flower of their manhood to fight the battles, but he didn't consult with them and didn't inform them. He consulted President Roosevelt on everything. There's no question about that, and you'll see when you get to this book, ladies and gentlemen. Just some of the chapter titles alone will tell you more than you need to know from the actual contents of the chapter. Martin Gilbert says that the famous Bases for Destroyers deal, whereby we gave to the Americans valuable real estate and Commonwealth and Empire possessions in the Caribbean and in Canada and down in South America in return for 50 destroyers that were completely useless. American destroyers that already seen their better days when the First World War began. And they never, not one of these 50 destroyers, fired a shot in anger in World War II. They were all completely useless. The only one that was used in World War II was the American destroyer Campbelltown, which we towed across the English Channel and sunk in the dock gates at St. Nazaire in March 1942. That's all it was good for, to be blown up in the dock gates, the Campbelltown. And in return for that, the Americans got very valuable foothold in Empire territories in the Western Hemisphere, a deal which the British secretly said was the beginning of our retreat from the West, in which the American diplomat, Adolph Burley, wrote in his private diary, he described in his private diary, this man very high up in the State Department, Deputy Under-Secretary of State, Adolph Burley said, "Thus, with one single gulp, we have obtained everything we wanted from the British Empire." With one single gulp. Doesn't that phrase tell us all we need to know about what the Americans are really after in World War II? We have this perception now, helped along, of course, by Hollywood and Madison Avenue, that the Americans were in there from the day it all began. That they were there riding like the American cavalry for the defense and rescue of civilization and freedom and all that we held dear, capital letters, all that we held dear. That's what the Americans have been telling us ever since. But they weren't. You Canadians were. You Canadians were in there from day 3 or day 4. But the Americans hung back until December 1941 on one pretext or another, because they didn't give a hoot about freedom, civilization, and all that we held dear. What they wanted was the money. As Roosevelt himself said in September 1938, I believe I've quoted it here, one of his cabinet ministers asked Roosevelt in September 1938, this crisis in Munich, this Czechoslovakian crisis, is this going to be good for us or bad? And Roosevelt answered, as the cabinet minister writes in his diary, it's the Secretary of the Interior, Ickes, his diary is in the Library of Congress now. Roosevelt answered, any crisis in Europe can only be good for us. Already the gold of the European nations is flooding across the Atlantic to buy guns and arms from us at a rate so great that we don't have enough warships to carry it. This is Roosevelt speaking in September 1938, and this was the emotion that spurred the Americans to help us in 1940. They didn't, of course, help us for nothing. When Britain needed help from the Americans made us pay for, with cash, every gun, tank and bullet and gallon of gasoline. I mean, it's an extraordinary situation when you come to consider it. The British were never told this. It's never really sunk into the British because they're sometimes a bit thick. The Americans made us buy everything we were getting from them to fight for freedom and civilization on their behalf. If I was to give you a bit of a parallel to see what I mean, the way the Americans behaved. We are the Americans, we're walking down the street. On the other side of the street, we see an old lady being mugged blind by 2 black men. She's being mugged ruthlessly by these 2 black men, and we rush across to help her. Before we help her, we say, "Madam, you're carrying a handbag, give me all your cash first before I drive these niggers off." Right? That's what the Americans said to us. And as she opens her handbag to give us her purse and all her coins, we see she's got a checkbook. So we say, before we now help you, would you mind writing out a check with your unremaining good arm, because the other arm's been broken? Would you mind writing out a check first for all the money you've got in the bank? And she does that, and she's, of course, blows the raining down on all this time. And we then say to her, "Madam, we'd like to help you desperately because we're fighting for freedom, civilization, and all that we hold dear. But before we do this, you've very probably got stocks and shares somewhere. We want you to sell all them too, and then we'll take all the cash, and then we'll come and help you." This is what the Americans did to us, the British Empire, in 1940 and 1941. They took all the cash, they took all the foreign currency, all the dollars that we had. When that was gone, they made us give all the gold that we had. And the gold was all gone by December 1940, except for about 28 million pounds of gold the Americans found we still had down in South Africa. And then the Americans sent an American battleship to Simonstown to pick up Britain's last gold. The British never told about this. Winston Churchill didn't go and make one of his famous broadcasts and say, the brave American nation has sent a battleship battling through the South Atlantic with its mission of mercy to pick up our last remaining gold. They didn't say that. It's kept very quiet. Because then the big end of empire sale really began, because Roosevelt and Morgenthau, the Secretary of the Treasury, were sitting down together. They discovered that we had stocks and shares all over the United States and all over South America. Movables, things that we could get our hands on, they said. So Roosevelt made us sell up everything we had, beginning with the Viscose Corporation of America, gigantic textiles combine, worth 150 million pounds. It was sold off to the Morgan Bank in Wall Street for $35 million. That's the difference, you see. When you're hard up, that's the way it goes. It's a bit rough, isn't it? When you're hard up, you've got to do it. You've got no choice. And that's what the Americans did to us to help us out of everything we'd got. By the end of 1941, every single asset that the British Empire had established in North and South America, movable assets, everything had gone, had been sold off on the orders of the American Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau, and at knockdown prices. The chemical corporations, the arms factories, the other companies, industries, the railroads in Venezuela, South America, everything was sold off and the British people never told about it. We know why the British people never told about it, because Winston Churchill instructed they weren't to be told about it. When Henry Morgenthau, the American Secretary of the Treasury, came to Britain in August 1944, he visited Churchill for lunch on the 4th of August 1944, and he said to Mr. Churchill, as we know, because Morgenthau kept a very good diary, which is in the archives now, Morgenthau said, Mr. Prime Minister, how are you going to break it to the British people that you've bankrupted them by fighting this war? Meaning from 1940 on to 1944 by that time. And Churchill's reply was, that is a doleful task that I propose to leave to my successor. The very words quoted by Churchill to Morgenthau. Morgenthau, 3 days later, back in Washington, reports them with enormous relish to President Roosevelt. And that's how we know all these things were said. I know what day it was because it's actually in Churchill's diary. You see, I've got Churchill's diaries. They were on his desk throughout the war. Commander Tommy Thompson stole the desk diaries off Churchill's desk at the end of the war, great big heap of them. He's dead, but his godson now has them, Simon Thompson. His godson he found out I was writing this book on Churchill. And I got a bit of reputation in England, and Thompson came to me and he said, Irving, you're writing this book on Churchill. I'm a great admirer of your work. I mean, your veracity, your integrity, your perspicacity, all the upright virtues that you have, some which were quite rightly mentioned by His Eminence just in the introductory speech. And then he said, I want to help you. I've got the Churchill diaries. I'm going to give them exclusively to you for your book. And I thought, how great. This is really altruism at it. But somehow between that moment and the next day, a sum of £250,000 is being mentioned that he wanted as the price for the handover. It was quite interesting the way he managed it. You couldn't actually see where the money was introduced into the deal, but I then said, of course, I don't believe in buying stolen property. I will rent it from you. So I rented the diaries from him for a year for £5,000, and we've got them here in this book. And it's interesting what you can see when you have the diaries of a man. The diaries which give his day-by-day, minute-by-minute movements. You can prove, for example, that he's a coward. Look at this one. This is from the Churchill diary. I've actually reproduced it in that little travelling brochure again, so those of you who got it already, the proud owner of this particular entry. November 1940. November the 14th, 1940, was the famous German air raid on Coventry. But 2 days before, Churchill had been told by the Air Ministry that there was going to be the biggest air raid of the war, because we had decoded the German signals. The biggest air raid of the war, and it was going to be on the first moonlight night, November the 14th, and the Air Ministry said to Churchill, because they'd been decoding the message incompletely, we believe the target must be London, because the second target is outer London, the third auxiliary target is the Thames Estuary, and the fourth auxiliary target is the outer countries, the home counties. So it stands to reason that the number one target, which is corrupt in our intercepts, must be London. So Churchill says, very well, so there's going to be a massive air raid on London on November the 14th. And the Air Ministry says, Prime Minister, not one. The German Air Force, according to the intercepted signal, Moonlight Sonata, is going to carry out air raids on London for 3 nights and 3 days, non-stop, 1,000 bombers, without respite. So Churchill says, in other words, beginning on the first full moon night in November, there's going to be 3 days in which London is going to be subjected to vicious, violent and barbarous attack. Well, you see what he's done. He's drawn a 3-day bracket on his diary with no appointments in London. He's not going to be there. He's going to leave the Londoners there. He's going to leave his private staff there. He's going to leave the cook, the budgery guard. Everybody's going to be left in number 10 Downing Street, but not Winston Churchill. Now, I've had a lot of debate about this particular act on Churchill's part ever since I've gone around the Commonwealth with this particular episode, and people say, but surely it's meet and right and proper. I mean, the Prime Minister, he has to look after his own life. He's entitled to take his personal measures. This is true, but let us look exactly what Churchill does on this particular day. November the 14th. He gets up. We know exactly what he's doing that day. We've got the diary. Midday he goes to Westminster Abbey because there's the unexpectedly Neville Chamberlain has died. His predecessor died of cancer of the throat. And there's a funeral service in Westminster Abbey. A little sidelight here on Churchill's character, of course. Churchill said, Neville Chamberlain, poor old Neville, history will judge harshly upon Neville Chamberlain. I know because I intend to write that history. And he intended also to see that Neville Chamberlain was given a fitting send-off because when that funeral service was held on this day, November the 14th, the coffin of Neville Chamberlain standing on the trestles at the end of the aisle, the end of the nave in Westminster Abbey, surrounded by flags and honour and pomp, and 1,000 members of the government sitting in the pews behind. We've all seen it on television during the funeral, wedding ceremonies and so on, the same famous nave. There's the coffin of Neville Chamberlain. At the end of the ceremony, instead of the coffin being solemnly borne out and placed on a gun carriage and taken to some graveyard, the coffin is opened, and a glass jam jar is taken out of the middle of the otherwise empty coffin containing poor old Neville Chamberlain's ashes. And these are tipped like old tea leaves into a hole in the floor of Westminster Abbey, that being the end of Churchill's hated predecessor. He'd staged this ceremony in front of the eyes of 1,000 of the most important members of his government as the way he got rid of people that he didn't like. So it's a horrendous thing. It's in the private diary. One of the people who were there, who was president, saw that happen. Churchill goes back to number 10 Downing Street that afternoon, and his first question is, any news on Moonlight Sonata? The answer is, yes, boss. It is tonight. The Germans had been heard sending out their weather plane, tracking the weather over the route, so we know tonight is the night. And is it going to be London still? Oh yes, the Air Ministry say that they still believe it's going to be London because that was the intercepted message they got. However, a German prisoner has been shot down 3 days ago who's been overheard by hidden microphones in his cell talking about the possibility of an air raid on Coventry. But we think tonight Moonlight Sonata must be London. Very well, says Churchill. What appointments? Answer, Prime Minister, 2:45 Lord Halifax, 3 o'clock Mr. Attlee, the Labour minister who had become the Deputy Prime Minister. So he gabbles through these afternoon appointments because it gets dark quite early, of course, in November in England. And he gabbles through the appointments, and at 3:30 or 4 he stands up, excuses himself from Mr. Attlee, and he hurries out to his car. Not outside the famous door of number 10 Downing Street that we're all so familiar with in the photographs, but out of the back garden gate. If you go to London now and you go to the back garden gate of number 10 Downing Street, you'll see it's still there, a brick wall let into the Horse Guards Parade at the back of number 10 Downing Street with a big wooden gate set in it, a big wooden door, where his car is waiting for him. And he gets into the car, accompanied by his private secretary, John Martin. Now Sir John Martin. He too has given me his diaries, and I think he regrets it. You'll see that November the 2nd, when his book is published. He gets into the car with John Martin and is about to drive off because he's in a hurry, when a messenger drives up from the Air Ministry with latest news on Moonlight Sonata in an envelope, handed through the window to Winston Churchill. Churchill doesn't wait to open it. He says, drive off, to the driver, because at any moment now the German bombers may arrive. It's getting dusk, faster and faster. As the car passes Hyde Park, Churchill has opened and read the envelope. He leans forward and raps on the glass partition and says, driver, back to number 10 Downing Street. The message says, Prime Minister, at 3 o'clock this afternoon. At 3 o'clock this afternoon, one of our planes found where the German blind bombing beams, which were switched on before every raid in the afternoon to test them, they intersect over Coventry and not over London at all. So the raid tonight's not on London, it's going to be on Coventry. The famous Coventry raid. Driver, back to number 10 Downing Street. He gets back to number 10 Downing Street, where his staff are waiting for him, assembled round the door, surprised to find that he's come back, because they thought he was going to be away for 2 or 3 days, as his appointment book shows. He says, and the words are testified to by Sir John Martin, to this effect: I have just received this doleful piece of intelligence from the Air Ministry, and he shows them the empty envelope. They say that tonight there is to be a barbarous and savage Nazi air raid on London. And it would not be right for the citizens of this hard-pressed metropolis to believe that I am so craven that I am not prepared to come here and withstand the same trials and tribulations to which they are nightly subjected by the German gangsters. And that night, if you go to the bookshops now and you buy the diaries of John Colville, who was Churchill's other private secretary, you will find Colville describing how that same night Churchill went up on the roof of the Air Ministry building, with his admiring staff, to await the oncoming German bombers, as he said, to show that he wasn't frightened of them, knowing, of course, as he alone knew, full well, that at that very moment, 100 miles to the north of London, the real raid was beginning on Coventry. Now, this is the real Winston Churchill. I have to say, on my knowledge of the diaries and on my knowledge of the war room log of RAF Fighter Command, that Churchill was never knowingly in London when he knew there was going to be an air raid. He let the whole of the rest of the city sweat it out. And so it was with every other city, of course. You couldn't tell Plymouth or Birmingham or Liverpool that they were going to be bombed. That I accept. And even if you couldn't tell London that they were going to be bombed, then it behoves you to stay there yourself, particularly if you've got 17 feet of concrete over your roof, as Churchill had in his bunker. You go there to London 9, you can see the bunker that he had that he could take shelter in. But he preferred to motor 150 miles out into the countryside to stay in the estate of Ronald Tree, one of the members of this secret pressure group that was set up with Jewish money in the 1930s. This focus group that was set up in 1936. Because there he felt safe, 150 miles outside London. And the next morning he would return. He would return and show himself to the bombed-out, blitzed Cockney population of east of London, putting on an Air Commodore's uniform, perhaps. Sometimes he liked an Air Commodore's uniform. I don't know what entitled him to wear it, but he would wear it and show himself in this Air Force uniform to the Londoners. Or he'd wear his sergeant suit. Or he'd wear his familiar hat, his pinstripe suit and trilby. And in this way he became popular, because the people said, good old Winnie, you're there too. You can take it, so can we. There was a famous film made, in fact, London Can Take It. Here's the beginning of the chapter, Good Old Winnie, and you see why he was doing it. He deliberately provoked the bombing of London to make himself popular, to kill the peace movement, which was at that time becoming a real political threat to him in Britain, to drag the Americans into the war. He said to Ambassador Joe Kennedy, one of my favorite characters, this Irish-American who became the ambassador in London, the American ambassador in London, father of the later President Kennedy. I've used his diaries and telegrams. He said to Kennedy, once the Nazis start bombing London, you Americans will have to come into the war, won't you? And when Hitler didn't do him the favor, as Churchill knew Hitler wouldn't, because we were reading the German codes, and since May 1940, Churchill had been reading the German Air Force signals. And he knew that Hitler had given orders that London was on no account to be bombed. So Churchill had gone out of his way to provoke the bombing of London. You'll find out exactly how he did it in July and August 1940. And the result was that when the bombing began on September the 7th, 1940, it was what Churchill wanted, because he was now beginning to become unassailably popular. Until now, he had scarcely known personal popularity. This is the chapter 33, Good Old Winnie. Now, with each new ordeal, it soared. Newsreels showed him touring troops, stumping warship gangplanks, inspecting gigantic guns, acknowledging with flamboyant upward sweep of square pork pie hat the cheers of bystanders. Recently, enemy transmitters had begun to rouse the workers against him, but these violent air raids gave him the chance to drive to their stricken suburbs and show himself to the newly bereaved and homeless, flicking Havana ash onto the glass-strewn sidewalks and waving his walking stick. 7,000 Londoners would die during the remainder of September 1940. 700 of them were children. He had gauged the British mood exactly. I was asked on Australian television very early, week 1 or week 2, one of the interviewers said to me, Mr. Irving, what are your feelings about Churchill now? Do you dislike the man? I said, dislike him, I hate him. This is the reason why. Because he conned us, he conned the British into believing that the whole of the barbarism, the Schrecklichkeit, was an inevitable result of the Nazi brutality. And now we find out it was something that he deliberately set out to provoke for his short-term political ends of prolonging the war to stay in power. Of course, this stoical, suffering people couldn't know that for reasons of grand strategy, he and Bomber Command had done their utmost to induce this very outrage. Nor that there was worse to come, nor that the carnage would last for 4 more years. A time bomb closed Regent Street for 2 days. Selfridges lost his windows, John Lewis burnt out. Everybody was at risk. The richer homes collapsed into larger heaps of rubble. That was the only difference. Most nights a fresh draw was held in this lethal lottery, and it unified those brave enough to remain in London. A newfound courage in adversity pervaded them, transcending class barriers and obscuring the old party distinctions. Through this rising chaos came, lisping and snuffling, the familiar voice of Mr. Churchill, broadcasting bravely to the nation, steady and reassuring, promising victory and crying revenge. It would take 10 years at the present rate for half the houses of London to be demolished, he calculated. After that, of course, progress would be much slower. Typical Churchill, we hear the voice in our ears at this moment. We hear it again and again on television and on the radio. We have recordings of Churchill's famous wartime speeches being broadcast. It's part of the warm bath of illusion that we British have been living in ever since the end of World War II. Nostalgic films, nostalgic situation commentaries on television, always the voice of Churchill and the picture of Mr. Churchill on the sitting room wall in the Afghan television series. And when I say now that voice we remember so clearly, Winston Churchill saying, "We will fight them on the beaches," at a time when Churchill knew from Codebreaking that Hitler had not the slightest intention of invading us. This was another of the great Churchill lies. Churchill knew that Britain was in no way threatened by Nazi invasion. But it suited his purpose to let his people believe that we were so endangered. "We will fight them on the beaches," these famous speeches. And if the British Empire and its Commonwealth should last for 1,000 years, people will still say, this was our finest hour. We know those speeches, they've been drilled into us since school time, and if I now say as I do, that we're not listening to the voice of Winston Churchill at all, that's the voice of a BBC actor. Because in the evenings of 1940, Churchill was in no condition to speak. He couldn't speak on the radio, he couldn't make BBC broadcasts, he barely managed his speeches in the House of Commons. Those speeches were broadcast in 1940 on the radio by a BBC actor by the name of Norman Shelley. It's quite extraordinary. I mean, those of you who were in England at the time, my generation, you remember Children's Hour, 5 p.m. every evening, Larry the Lamb. Larry the Lamb was Norman Shelley. Norman Shelley was Winston Churchill in those evenings. Many a time when Churchill had made these broadcasts, these famous "we shall fight them on the beaches" broadcasts, sometimes a telegram would come to number 10 Downing Street, which is in the archives now. I've quoted them here. People worried about his health, saying, "Winston, you must look after your health a bit more. You didn't sound yourself on the radio last night." He didn't sound himself because he wasn't himself. He was Larry the Lamb that night. It's a sad thing, of course. Sometimes when I deliver this, the reaction is different. It's not hilarity. Sometimes an icy hush falls on the audience. And I saw it happen either in Chilliwack or Kelowna last time I was here. And an elderly English couple, obviously English, got up and with great dignity and without disturbing anyone, got up and walked out at the back of the hall at that point. Because until that moment they had suspended disbelief. They didn't want to believe what I was saying. They thought it was all just part of a glib kind of street market salesman's talk. But suddenly that struck true. And the realization that in their memory all these years they've been listening to the voice of Larry the Lamb, it was a cold tap being run into this warm bath of illusion that they've been living in. The belief all these years that World War II was a journey that was worthwhile because there was no alternative. And suddenly along come I, a child at the time, a baby. Lord Denning, in fact, said Mr. Irving was a babe in arms at the time of the convoy in question. That's what Lord Justices sometimes do when they want to influence a jury against him. He was a babe in arms. So I was. And it upset the Englishmen of that generation who listened to the sirens howl and watched the V-1s flying overhead, as I saw them too. I remember that very clearly, the flying bombs and the rockets. To realize it had all been brought down upon us by the folly of our own Prime Minister. And that he was no longer the greatest living Englishman who had saved the British Empire, but he was the greatest living idiot who, for his own opportunistic reasons, had dragged the British Empire down with him and had eventually in 1945 turned it over to the Labour Party. And we saw what happened then during the Labour Party's brief period of post-war rule. It began with India and it went on and it ended in a decline which never ended. Churchill gave the Labour Party the kiss of life in 1940 at a time when the Labour Party in Britain was on the verge of complete oblivion. If there had been a general election in Britain in 1939 or 1940, the Labour Party would have vanished from sight. We wouldn't have been dealing with Arthur Scargill and Neil Kinnock and all the rest of these socialist theoreticians now in London, because they would have vanished. I don't know what would have replaced them, but the Labour Party was dead. And then out of their tunnel of darkness there came Mr. Churchill in May 1940 and said to the Labour Party's leaders, the miracle had happened. I need you, said Churchill, because without you, the Labour Party, I cannot survive in office. The national government, the hour had struck. And the Labour Party, of course, very cleverly said to Churchill, very well, we will guarantee you your majority in the House, provided you have Labour ministers in your cabinet, and your Deputy Prime Minister is Labour, Clement Attlee, and you guarantee within the period of the next Parliament to introduce Labour legislation, trades union legislation, socialist reform, social welfare. All the great Labour schemes which had their origin in World War II were introduced by Mr. Churchill's government, and of course he got the payoff in 1945 when the Labour Party defeated him. And that was the beginning of the end of the empire. It's funny, isn't it, how logical everything becomes when you look back to that period. And what Churchill most successfully duped us over in that summer of 1940 was not just the great invasion threat, that we shall fight them on the beaches kind of propaganda he put out. It wasn't just the bombing story where Churchill said, we will hit back, look what the barbarians have done in London, we will strike back. It wasn't these two particular scams. The real problem was that we had a generous peace offer made to us in May and June of that year, 1940, which was so generous that even Churchill was inclined to accept it, only to come back to Cabinet the next day and hit himself on the head and say, what am I doing? If I accept this peace offer the Germans have given us now, I, Churchill, am finished. And so he tells the Cabinet, we must fight on, we have no alternative, we are not going to surrender. When Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, rather weakly said and protested, Prime Minister, we're not talking about surrender, we're just talking about accepting the German peace offer. It's not even terms. Let me tell you what the German peace offer was. It's in the German records, it's in the Swedish records, it's in the Swiss records, it's in the American records. It's not in the British records, except if you look very hard, because the British archives have been blanked out so you can't read them. We have a 30-year rule in Britain which says that you're allowed to see any official documents if they're over 30 years old. It's very, very selective. You go to the records of the British War Cabinet and you find that the meetings of May and June 1940, and you're given just bound volumes of Xerox copies, photocopies of the Cabinet minutes, with blank paragraphs which have been blanked out so you can't read them. And if you go to the private diaries of the ministers who were present, people like Lord Halifax, and you've got to go up to Yorkshire to see that, then you find what happened that afternoon was that Hitler's peace offer was being discussed, and that Mr. Churchill says, I think we would be wrong not to accept Hitler's peace offer. But of course this is something we can't... It has to be taken out of the official records now, because it's embarrassing. It's embarrassing for the British government now in the archives to admit that in 1940 we could have had peace. Instead of which we went the other way. We took the other road down the crossroads. We decided to fight on for 5 years. For what? For Poland? Didn't exactly help the Poles. Well, what were we fighting for? Defend the British Empire. This is the next version, the Winston Churchill version. We had to fight to defend the British Empire. We will fight them on the beaches. It must be true because he himself said it. This too is baloney, of course, because after 1941, nobody's talking about fighting to defend the British Empire, because now our great saviors, the Americans, are in the war too, and there's not one GI who's going to fight to defend the British Empire. So gradually it becomes we are fighting because we have to fight the devil incarnate. We have no choice. Any sacrifice is worth... No sacrifice is too great to defeat Adolf Hitler. This, of course, is the familiar version we have before us now. 1945, nobody thought about Poland anymore. Of course, nobody thought about saving the British Empire anymore. It's funny how that version gradually slid from Poland through the British Empire to fighting Adolf Hitler. And, of course, fighting Germany, because then when the offer was made to us by groups of Germans, what if we killed Hitler? Churchill said, what's that? I can't quite hear what you're saying. He was so busy fighting the Germans. He wanted to fight on whatever. Now, this, of course, is a very different version of history. It's a version of history that is completely unacceptable to the modern school, which believes that World War II was worthwhile. It's what we're being told the whole time by Hollywood and by Madison Avenue. So it must be true. If enough people say the same thing, it becomes true. If enough professors say the same thing, it becomes true. That's how it is in the academic world. One professor says something, he's quoted by 10, 20, 30, 40 other professors, and it becomes true. They all look around, they all find they're saying the same thing, so it has thereby become true. Even if it never was true, by the mere fact of being repeated by enough famous names, it becomes true. Like one of those big gas-filled blimps that floats around over the cities. It's there, it's up there, it's got all these names written on it, so it exists. Completely divorced from any kind of ground contact, but it does exist, and it floats around, and it's kind of Freemasonry, these professors. I quote you in my footnotes if you quote me in your footnotes. It's a kind of schoolboy thing grown big. They're kind of comparing footnotes, and they're all quoting each other in each other's footnotes. A professor who isn't quoted in anybody's footnotes doesn't exist. It's a kind of philosophical concept. So they all go around quoting each other. And this is the way these great theories of modern history evolve. They're all busy quoting each other, and therefore it becomes true. And they're all terrified that somebody's going to come along like me with a completely different theory. And this is, unfortunately, the trouble that my book has aroused, because all the way across the whole history of the Second World War, all these historians have just been quoting each other. And, of course, Winston Churchill got in first. It has to be said that as a man of 73 to sit down and write a 6-volume history, he has enormous stamina. Each volume as big as this book, I suppose. But by getting in first, he guaranteed that he got his version of history across first. And for a long time, he had his way. But you've only got to look at the Winston Churchill versions of history, these 6 volumes, and you see the great fallacy in them. There's not a mention in any of the 6 volumes of Churchill's history of codebreaking, which was his one great advantage. He had this Olympic view of everything going on around him. He alone Few other members of his cabinet had the same access to the code-breaking results that he did. The Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, wasn't able to read these intercepts. Churchill alone knew everything that was going on, and he played them like a master gambler. A master gambler going into game after game after game with a mirror held over his opponent's head. He alone had it, and everybody says of him, what a wonderful poker player he is. Boy, he scoops the pool every time. And it isn't until years later, in fact 1975 it was, that the world finds out that he wasn't a master gambler at all, that he was reading Hitler's signals throughout. Which is the whole secret of the Winston Churchill story. But then, of course, it is our bounden duty, go back and start re-examining history from 1940 onwards and say, if Churchill was reading Hitler's signals, then he knew that Hitler had no intention of bombing London. So how did the Blitz begin? And this is what we should all have been doing. The only reason I came into it, ladies and gentlemen, because I wrote the Hitler biography first, for 10 years, which meant that for 10 years I was moving around on the other side of this darkened mirror, so to speak, and I knew the truth. I knew what was going on because I knew the German archives. And I was asking myself the whole time, why is there no reference to the German peace offer in the British archives? Well, the reason that I am now becoming very unpopular with my books should by now become clear beyond peradventure to all of you, I think, is because these are based on the archives, is based on the private diaries, on the unexpurgated diaries. And I emphasize that because you'll frequently find, if you look in the diaries of people like Admiral Cunningham or Sir Alexander Cadogan or Admiral Ralph Edwards, you'll find these diaries have been partly published, but sanitized. Like the archives in Britain, they've been sanitized. And the only way you can find out the truth is by doing the footwork and spending the money, and it stands to reason. Churchill writes to Stalin. If Churchill wants to keep that document secret, or the British want to keep the document secret, then they can take the carbon copy out of Churchill's files, but they can't go to Moscow and take the original letter out of Stalin's files. So the fact that the Russians have made their documents available to me is of great importance in this book. Here, for the first time, we find in my books the Russians have given me the records of all their ambassadors' meetings with Churchill long before the war. Long before the war in Britain, Churchill was meeting the Soviet ambassador and planning a grand alliance between Britain and the Soviet Union. Churchill was just an ordinary member of Parliament, and yet he was conducting the extraordinary intrigues for the Soviet ambassador, to which he makes no reference in his memoirs, but is in the Soviet archives, and I've quoted him in this book. So it's a rather gloomy picture which emerges of the man. A man who was determined to get back into power all the way through the 1930s. He didn't care who paid him. He did what they said. He turned the whole of Britain against Germany in the mid-1930s at a time when the average Englishman was rather pro-German. He forced us into the war. When the war was then running, he made the war continue. From 1940 onwards, he used the most cynical methods to prolong the war, calling down the enemy bombers on his own civilian population in London and in other cities, lying the whole time, telling the British they were subject to invasion. Let me tell you one tiny episode which will convince you who our real friends were. We know who our enemies were. President Roosevelt, who said, my great ambition in life is to see the destruction of the British Empire, beginning with India, a verbatim quotation from one of the diaries of one of his secretaries of from the Vice President, Henry Wallace. Or Joseph Stalin, friend of the British Empire? No, Adolf Hitler. On the day that the Japanese invaded Singapore, and Singapore finally surrendered, on that day, 8th of February 1942, Hitler was with a dear old lady who I knew very well, his private secretary, Christa Schroeder. And they were travelling by train back from Berlin to East Prussia when the news came that Singapore had capitulated. A humiliating defeat. One more fiasco for Churchill, the end of the British Empire in the Far East. And Hitler got the news, the communique, announcing Britain's defeat, and he tore it up, angrily. And he stomped off down the gangway, followed by his secretary, Christa Schroeder. And after a while he turned round and said to Frau Schroeder, who died a couple of years ago, he said, Christa, you know what I would most like to do? If I had the chance now, 1942, I'd like to give the British 7 of our finest Wehrmacht army divisions to throw the Japanese out of Malaya. And that man is our enemy. It's all very confused, isn't it? So you can see why my book has set the cat among the pigeons. I quote that in Hitler's War, I quote other documents in this volume and in the subsequent volume. And believe me, my books are not going to get shot down easily, because I've not relied on anybody else's books, so I haven't imbibed their prejudices. The most you'll find perhaps is half a dozen printing errors in this book, perhaps. Half a dozen in 3 million letters. Not bad. I'm not going to issue a general call for 10,000 volumes to go back to the workshop on that account. I've got no fear. Is there anything that we can say good about the old man? Well, I mentioned his stamina, a certain amount of personal courage. He set out on these long-distance flights around Europe, going to Tehran and Moscow and other places. Not bad for a man of his age in the plains of those days. He was a great orator, of course, a wonderful writer, and a great wit and raconteur. But volatile. Who of us know, for example, that in June 1940, we'll find it in this book, in June 1940, June the 13th or 14th, 1940, he got together with the French representatives in London and said, we're going to make one great country. France and Britain will become one country. One people, one language, one head of state, one army, with General de Gaulle as Commander-in-Chief of the British-French Army. This is June 1940. You won't find it in the British archives, but I found it in the French archives. The documents signed by Churchill, the personal telephone conversations between Churchill and General de Gaulle and Monsieur Paul Reynaud, the French Prime Minister. In fact, I found it in the private papers of Paul Reynaud, the French Prime Minister in 1940. Long ago dead. His widow, I visited her, still living in the shadow of the French Parliament building in Paris. One arm gone already, one arm in the grave, but with the other good arm I got her to sign authorization for me to see her husband's papers in the French National Archives, and there was this extraordinary madcap Churchill plan. When you shake your head and you say how the King of England didn't know this was happening, and of course the Canadians didn't know this was happening. I'm not sure what would have happened to the Canadians if we had a kind of one British-French nation. It had all been designed, and then a few years later Churchill designed exactly the same thing between Britain and America. Britain and America, one nation. British should become Americans, the Americans should become British. Great advantage for the Americans. I'm not sure if it would be a great advantage for the British, but there would be one head of state, one head of the army, and one currency. Here it is, a picture of the currency that Churchill himself designed. Yeah, I've got a slightly blown up version of the Churchill himself designed on the back of a postcard. You can look at it later if you come up and talk with me. I found it on the wall of the flat of Mrs. Ronald Tree in New York, who now lives in a very lavish building in New York, the wife of this millionaire Conservative member of Parliament. And if you look closely, you'll see that the Anglo-American currency, which Churchill designed for this Anglo-American nation, it consists of a pound sign and a dollar sign. The pound appears to be riding on the back of the dollar, in fact, if you look closely, and the pound, I think, has its arms clutched tightly round the dollar. If you look closely, you can see that the pound also has its legs wrapped around the dollar, or is possibly committing an indecent offence of the kind that used to be a prerequisite for joining the British Secret Service. It's one of the English characteristics, ladies and gentlemen. We had a Labour Member of Parliament, Tom Dryburgh. Tom Dryburgh, a notorious homosexual and Soviet agent, Labour Member of Parliament. Tom Dryburgh, now dead, so I can libel him at will. Tom Dryburgh announced that he was going to get married. He was a homosexual, and the photograph of the future Mrs. Tom Dryburgh was brought into Winston Churchill in the House of Commons smoking room, and she was as ugly as sin. And Churchill took one look at this photograph of the future wife of the homosexual Labour Member of Parliament, and he said, well, I suppose beggars can't be choosers. But he didn't say beggars. He didn't say beggars, he used another word. Or on another occasion, Lord Montague of Beaulieu, he was acquitted by the Old Bailey on a very similar charge involving young Boy Scouts. Rightly or wrongly, difficult to say, but Lord Montague was acquitted. The photographs, the headlines were brought in to Winston Churchill, again in the smoking room of the House. Lord Montague acquitted. The whole house, I remember this very clearly, the whole nation had followed the Lord Montague case with great interest.
Lord Montague of who?
Lord Montague of Beaulieu. Lord Montague of Beaulieu. And he was acquitted. I take it that you don't know him. Lord Montague of Beaulieu was acquitted anyway, and the photographs were taken, the headlines were taken into Winston Churchill. Old Bailey acquits Lord Montague, and Churchill took one look at the headlines and said, if I had my way, I'd have him cast into a bottomless pit. It takes a minute. Winston Churchill, that was the story, the dark and light side. It's not warts and all, as you see. At the end of his life, I had the chance actually of going to see Winston Churchill. It was granted to all of us in London University. I was in university at the time, 1960. The word went round, all of us, the grand old man would show himself one last time. Who knows, he might die tomorrow. In his house in Hyde Park Gate, which was about 300 or 400 yards from the university where I was studying physics. The whole student body flocked there like sheep and packed Hyde Park Gate all afternoon in the hope that Churchill would duly expose himself at the second floor window upstairs, which he then did, as far as I'm told, because I took a positive policy decision not to go and see him. I had decided in 1960 that I didn't like him. 1963, he then finally made his last showing in the House, February. And I have the private diary of one of the two members of Parliament who actually supported him as he tottered up and down the aisle, Sir John Langford Holt, a captain of the Royal Navy in the Second World War. And Churchill made his grand exit for the last time from that beloved floor of his in the House of Commons. And as he tottered to the end of the House, he turned round for one last time, The whole house standing on its feet, waving its order papers and cheering. And amidst the hubbub could be heard the voice of one member of Parliament saying to another, "Poor old boy, just look at him, gone completely gaga, hasn't he?" And Churchill stopped. And he cast off the two supporting arms of the members of Parliament, rather like the QE2, the Queen Elizabeth II, the liner, casting off the tugs in the Hudson River. And he turned round and he said, "Yes, and there are some who say he's as deaf as a post." Ladies and gentlemen, that is all on Winston Churchill Volume 1. We are going to have a brief intermission. Thank you very much. Does somebody have a question? Yes, a journalist. Yes.
I'm at the Vancouver Sun, Mr. Irving.
Yes.
What I do want to ask you is, the peace offer in 1940 from the Germans, what were the details?
We know what the details were because they are in the private papers of the Swedish intermediary. They're in several other private papers too, but they're most clearly in the private papers of the Swedish intermediary, who actually has them signed by Hermann Goering, who was with Hitler at the time that was made. It was that Hitler would withdraw the German armies from France and the Western countries, and from Poland and Czechoslovakia, apart, of course, from the territories which had always been German, which he had fought the war over in the first place. Poland and Czechoslovakia would be granted a form of sovereignty, in other words, a limited kind of sovereign independence. France and the Western European countries wouldn't be further molested. They would be left alone. They wouldn't have any further claims made on them. And you can see what actually happened to France. France was actually allowed to keep her entire fleet intact, which is an extraordinary end for a war. In the armistice, Article 8 of the armistice that the French signed allowed the French to keep their entire fleet under German supervision. But particularly for me as an Englishman, it was interesting his guarantee that if anything happened to Britain, then he was willing to give us assistance if we asked for it, to throw aggressors out of the British Empire, including whether those aggressors were his own allies, the Italians, the Russians and the Japanese. But I think it's an extraordinarily generous peace offer, and you see it referred to again and again in the German archives and in some of the British archives.
The 1942 memo regarding the final solution.
Yes.
Is it not possible that that is covering one's tracks?
I don't think there's any evidence anywhere in the German archives of track covering. One often gets questions like this: isn't it possible that the Germans would have destroyed any incriminating evidence? And my answer to that is, if you've ever been in archives and you see what documents look like and how many tens of thousands of tons there are, even in peacetime, in the chaos of a final collapse, you couldn't. And quite apart from that, we in Britain were reading the German SS police unit code messages, so there are documents the Germans couldn't have destroyed. The Germans are very thorough when it comes to documenting what they're doing. All Hitler's other crimes are documented. This particular one, the biggest crime of the lot, we are told, has no documents at all. The only documents which do exist, and which I referred to in my Hitler biography, is a consistent string of documents from 1923 right through to 1944, where Hitler is putting out his hands to protect the Jews, either individually or as a whole, against the excesses of the Nazi Party. It's an unusual thing. You won't find one single document where he is taking an action against the Jewish community.
On the other hand, if I hired Louis the Lip to take you off at the leg, there's nothing in writing.
This is a very small-scale operation involving a distance of about 20 or 30 feet. We're talking about a Hitler operation which involves shipping millions of Jews 1,500 miles across Europe and then liquidating them at the terminus. It's the kind of thing involving a lot of people apart from Louis the Lip. Louis the Lip, if he was well advised, would still try and get some kind of incriminating evidence on me or on you or on whoever gave him the job, so that if he puts it in the bank safe. So all the way up you find documents where the people refer to Hitler's authority for the transport movement. They say, auf Führerbefehl, on the Führer's orders, the Jews are being shipped from west to east, but nowhere is a single document saying that what happened at the other end was on the Führer's orders.
Thank you very much.
Okay. This gentleman in the front.
I believe you said something about that you started looking into the German archives. I'd like to know what set you off initially in the first place to this whole study and research.
What set me off on the German archives? After I left university, I then went to Germany to be a steelworker for a year to learn the language. As a steelworker, I met somebody who had been in Dresden in the air raid. And he told me everything that had happened. I realized that I was very ignorant as an Englishman not to know that we had carried out an air raid that killed 100,000 people in 3 hours. So I wrote a book. And that book became a bestseller, The Destruction of Dresden. And after that I wrote a whole string of books, one book a year. I remember I wrote a book and I had a daughter, and I wrote a book and I had a daughter, and I wrote a book and I had a daughter. I had 4 books and 4 daughters. And I ran out of steam completely after that, and I just write books now.